Well, the Pentagon says the US is preparing to take significant action against militias which have hit American targets. For days, the Biden administration has been hinting at strikes in retaliation for a drone attack on a remote US military base in northwestern Jordan, known as Tower 22. 3 American troops were killed in the incident on Sunday. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said it's time to take further action against militias backed by Iran that have attacked US forces on land and at sea. He also said that while wishing to avoid the conflict escalating, the US will not hesitate to act.
The President will not tolerate attacks on American troops, and neither will I. Our teammates were killed by radical militias backed by Iran and operating inside Syria and Iraq. So this is a dangerous moment in the Middle East. We will continue to work to avoid a wider conflict in the region. But we will take all necessary actions to defend the United States, our interests, and our people. And we will respond when we choose, where we choose, and how we choose.
Let's look at this with Bradley Bowman, who's Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power in Washington, D.C. Welcome to DW. What are you hearing about the when, where and how?
Thank you for the opportunity to join you. You know, the Biden administration has been deliberately vague on the when and the how, and I think that's appropriate, right? Because Washington does not want to give its targets a lot of advance notice because that would endanger U.S. forces and change the results. But at the same time, there's been a lot of signaling here. The administration seems to be looking for some sort of Goldilocks strategy, if you will, where it's not too hard and not too soft. The premise of this administration for months now has been that American restraint is the best path forward. The problem with that approach is that we've seen more than 165 attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq, Syria, and now Jordan. And many Republicans in Congress think that's what brought us to this horrible point where we've seen the lives of 3 service members taken, members who will not be returning to their families. So there's many in Washington pushing for strong attacks, but this is more art than science, and they're trying to find that sweet spot between reestablishing, bolstering deterrence, but not starting a larger war.
OK, so no a when or how. What about where?
Yeah, you know, I think it's almost certain that we'll see significant attacks. This is my informed conjecture in Syria, maybe in Iraq. There's some disincentive to conduct these attacks in Iraq because when the U.S. conducts these attacks, it creates pressure in Baghdad to try to evict U.S. forces, which would be a gift to Iran and a gift to the Islamic State. So I think that we'll probably see attacks over multiple days, certainly in Syria, some in Iraq, and perhaps elsewhere. And many in Washington are saying that if you just focus on the terror proxies, the puppets, if you will, and avoid the puppet master in Iran, then it plays right into the Islamic Republic of Iran's decades-long strategy where they advance their interests through others and to displace the counterpunches and consequences onto others, usually Arabs.
You've talked about this Goldilocks strategy. Not so hard enough to deter further attacks, but not so hard as to provoke more attacks. Escalation does seem inevitable as you look at the events of the last few weeks between clashes between the IDF and Hezbollah along the Israel-Jordan border, the US and Britain striking Houthi targets in Yemen, and now this talk of America hitting targets perhaps in Syria, perhaps in Iraq. The escalation seems inevitable.
Yes, but it is interesting that everyone sounds the alarm about escalation when America responds. I mean, imagine for people watching at home, imagine your home was hit 165 times and the homeowner repeatedly said, knock it off, please stop, and they keep attacking your home 165 times. When that homeowner responds, I wouldn't call that escalation. I would call that common sense self-defense to knock off the attacks. I think the real danger right now for Washington is too weak of a response rather than too strong. Sorry.
Right. OK. So the idea, though, that Washington whether with or without its allies, goes ahead and attempts this Goldilocks response, you don't think it carries a strong risk of the whole thing going up in flames?
I think it's very likely, as a student of history and a student in this region and as someone who's studied defense and national security issues for a long time, that if the U.S. does the strong response, which I believe restoring deterrence requires, that you may have a short-term escalation. Of course. We saw that in January 2020 in Iraq, when after the Qasem Soleimani killing, we saw 2 U.S. bases in Iraq hit with ballistic missiles from Iran, an act of war against Iraq, and it had more than 100 U.S. service members with traumatic brain injury. So I hope and expect the Pentagon is taking steps now to protect U.S. forces for the inevitable response which will come. But that doesn't mean the United States can sit on our hands, because we can't leave our adversaries with the impression that they can kill our soldiers and face no consequences. That's unacceptable.
Bradley Bowman from the Centre on Military and Political Power, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I'm joined now by Alex Vatanka, Director of the Iran Program at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the program, Alex. Now, we've just heard those strong words from the Defense Secretary there. What more can you tell us about the possible targets and timing?
Good to be with you, Tommy. I think timing remains to be seen. Clearly, the United States needs to act. The killing of 3 soldiers by this Iraq-based militant group really demands action and a response. It will be significant. And in terms of targets and your question, look, it really depends. I think overall, if you look at the axis of resistance that Iran has been spearheading in recent decades, it spans from Hezbollah in Lebanon, and to some extent we could call the Houthis in Yemen on the other side of the Middle East also a proxy of sorts of the Islamic Republic. I don't think these organizations will be targeted. I think the U.S. will be very specifically going after those militant groups that have been carrying about 167 attacks against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. So I think it will be very targeted. I don't think it will be a sort of major attack against some of the bigger players in the axis of resistance like Hezbollah. It will be minor groups that the U.S. will go after.
So you don't think this could cause some kind of escalation in military tensions, particularly after the U.S. has said it's not seeking war with Iran?
If you mean escalation in the sense of a regional war, I don't think that is likely to happen for one simple reason. The United States, as White House has made it very clear, is not interested in regional war. I don't think the Israelis are interested in a regional war at this point, and certainly the Iranians are not interested in regional war. So I think most likely what would happen is, clearly, you don't want a regional war if you're Washington, but clearly you want to make sure you reinforce the idea of deterrence. You have thousands and thousands of American troops across the Middle East. For them to become sort of sitting targets for militant groups is unacceptable to any American president, and certainly this American president who just entered election cycle. So for political reasons in the United States, and because the reality is on the ground, something needed to be done, but nothing as large as inviting a regional war, which I just said, I really don't think is of the interest of any of the larger players.
You mentioned the political angle there. How big a part does that have to play?
Oh, it's important. I mean, for any American president, it would be important when American soldiers are killed overseas. And for this particular American president, as he's facing re-election, he needed to do something. But at the same time, I think President Biden knows that the American public opinion is not interested in another large war in the Middle East. That's the last thing American public opinion wants. But when you start killing Americans, it requires a response. And I think the Iranian side clearly understood that. If you noticed the last few days, Tehran is trying to distance itself from these proxies. And the proxy group responsible for the attack in Jordan has itself now suspended attacks in the United States. So I think that tells us quite a bit about where each is coming from and where we're likely to go in the near future.
Okay, so Iran as a whole, you would say they don't have a major overall objective in backing these groups?
Well, clearly Iran does have a long-term objective, and that goes back to the Iranian Revolution of 1979. There are 2 key pillars to that. One is to basically bring the end of the state of Israel. The other one is to push the United States out of the Middle East. But that's a long-term strategy of the Iranian regime. If you listen to Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, he's not asking for war and these objectives to be met next week or next month or even next year. He's saying that's a long-term strategy. Now, that's a whole different issue, and how the West deals with that requires a strategy on the part of the West, which frankly doesn't exist right now. But in the short term, as I said, I doubt very much anybody's interested in a regional war that would essentially put everybody at a loss.
Okay. Alex Vatanka, Director of the Iran Program at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for your insights.